Sri Aurobindo describes how the initial mental realization of the One and the Infinite deepens into a spiritual experience where the realization is held in the very substance of our being. The ego persists at first in a habitual movement, but its movements become broken, crushed, weak, and eventually there is a complete dissolution that gradually settles in the being, where the peace of the self begins to fill the whole being, at first through a reflection and gradually more and more directly. And sometimes in a sudden transition or otherwise in a gradual change, there is a sense of a cosmic consciousness, an opening into a universality, and a pushing back, rending or pushing down of the walls which imprisoned our being. Loss of individuality, loss of personality. There is no longer an ego or a definable person, only existence, only peace and bliss. And he says, one becomes immortality, becomes eternity, becomes infinity. All that is left of the personal soul is a hymn of peace and freedom and bliss, vibrating somewhere in the eternal. From this, Sri Aurobindo moves to the difficulty which we experience whenever there is a sudden change or a new experience, that there is a kind of an alternation between that experience and its loss. And this is the portion we had read last time. When there is an insufficient purity in the mental being, the release appears at first to be partial and temporary. And this, he says, is because there is a screen that comes in between, either with the movements of nature from its past habits, or from lack of purity with the receiving consciousness. The cloud intervenes and disappears. The rhythm of ascent and descent renews itself until the impurity has been worked out. And this period of alternation can be easily long in the integral yoga, because what is demanded here is an entire perfection of the system. If the goal was simply to withdraw, one would have had nothing to do with the impure substance of our nature left behind. But if the goal is to transform that substance, to make it a vehicle for a divine consciousness to manifest in a divinized expression, then the demand of purity requires
a continued working bit by bit on all the parts of our nature. And therefore, this period of alternations may easily be long in the integral yoga. Because the goal is to have this utter realization, not just in a state of deep trance, but in full activity in all conditions. To this extent, you will find what he has described is in complete consonance with the objectives of the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna asks Arjuna to establish himself in this consciousness of Brahman, and from there act in life. And in the most extreme circumstance of life, which is in the middle of the battlefield. But if, and this is the portion now we take up, which we briefly read last time, but if or when our conscious being has become sufficiently pure and clear, station in the higher consciousness, the impersonalized jiva, one with the universal or possessed by the transcendent, lives high-seated above and looks down undisturbed at whatever remnants of the old working of nature may revisit the system. So while these periods of alternations are still happening, certain tendencies come back, go, and come back and go. Where is your consciousness? The one who has been so far working to free himself from the ego is stationed in this consciousness for universality, or even in possession or possessed by the transcendent, or at least under its influence. And so from there, one looks at all these things happening. Oh yes, the body is getting again agitated and restless. The emotions are getting upset. The thoughts have this tendency once again. But I am none of these. I stand back, undisturbed. I may choose to do something or not. In either case, high-seated above, undisturbed. He cannot be moved by the work, the three modes of Prakriti in his lower being. Can he be shaken from his station by the attacks even of grief and suffering? These are the two most poignant of our emotions when we are overwhelmed with grief, or there is an extreme form of suffering. While some part of our nature may be overwhelmed, I, the person seated above and observing, am not affected. So there's a kind of a double station where you are personally free, but you still see this vehicle through which you've been working in the world that is going through its own rounds. And after this, there is a still higher station. And finally, there being no veil between, the higher peace overpowers the lower disturbance and mobility. There is a settled silence in which the soul can take sovereign possession of itself above and altogether. So while this double status may continue for a long time, eventually the higher station begins to extend its influence. You may watch, yes, the body is going through its exhaustion, the emotions are going through their disturbance, but after a while, whatever fluctuates, tires, exhausts, and when it's exhausted and no more offering a resistance, the peace from the higher parts comes and settles into them, changes from within. And there is a sustained pressure gradually. Each time the illusionism of nature is less and less and less. The habits gradually fade. Now there are two kinds of here. One is the choice to not bother with nature, which is often the case in many ascetic traditions, sometimes even beating down nature, as if to train the body with whips or with pain to snuff out its tendencies, and almost as if in fear of this harsh punishment, the tendencies of our nature weakened because they're beaten down, but it leaves the nature inert, often incapable. People who have been through that kind of training can often be extremely kind, gentle, or sweet, but they will not be strong. They will always be helpless, dependent, unable to become centers of some activity or dynamic or leadership, because the personality has been as if crushed in an unhealthy way. On the other hand, one could simply take the poise that it does not matter, and I persist as it wants to, I turn away, I don't care, and I remain, let's say, for hours in meditation, perhaps the whole day, in deep, indrawn silence, in some liberated state. But even in that case, when briefly one has to re-engage with nature, if nothing else, at least to eat food, one will find often that the coarseness of the nature is even exaggerated, because nature has not been given a chance to soften up through the normal activities of engagement in life. All of these belong to a very crude ascetic approach, not relevant at all for us. On the other side, though, one may take an active, that is, from this station of freedom, one may choose to allow or even will that influence of freedom to settle in the whole being. In that case, the whole process can speed up enormously. And especially as the veil thins, the higher peace overpowers the lower disturbance and mobility. Still silence. This silence is a condition in which physically one can feel in the body and in the actions of the person that there is this poise, that there is this peace supporting or glowing out through the form. Such possession is not indeed, so he's described how the soul can take possession of the whole range, the higher and the lower. Such possession is not indeed the aim of the traditional yoga of knowledge, whose object is rather to get away from the above and the below and the all, undefinable absolute. But whatever the aim, the path of knowledge must lead to one first result, and absolute quietude. Now this is the first result which is assured. After that, there can be a second result and a third result, which we may or may not choose to accept. But that is a question of what direction we take the sadhana in. Else, this first result is the outcome of this path of knowledge. But a very important distinction is made between the traditional yoga of knowledge and the path of integral knowledge. And this distinction is important. Sri Aurobindo now will also align these two. Having made the distinction, he will align them and will see the place of the traditional goal, and we will see it as a poise, a special experience, a special station of the consciousness from which will complete and unify and bring back the mastery of the world from a still higher poise. And so this description now is extremely important for us, because it will help first to understand where that traditional ascetic goal of the spirituality fits in the larger framework of the integral yoga. Second, it will help us, as we read, to enter into an understanding of what a person in that consciousness feels and sees and experiences of the world, and why they behave in certain ways or don't behave in certain ways, why their perspective and their values of the world are so different from the normal life values. We will understand this and it will make a lot of sense. And then third, at the same time as the surface parts in us will understand, the deeper parts within us will feel a resonance of the experiences as it describes them. That resonance prepare us for that experience to settle. We have already experienced this as we have gone through this and other passages. As Sri Aurobindo describes these experiences, we feel as if we are being drawn into it. Some part of us is being pulled into the experience. And we must not dismiss it as mere imagination. It is a real experience that we have, but in a part. The first contact with what will take us into the fullness of the deeper experience. And so if we value it, if we cherish it, if we reread and remain immersed in it, prepares the ground and begins the process of the deepening into the full experience. So this will be 3 ways in which we will be approaching the following 2 pages. So, but whatever the aim, the path of knowledge must lead to one first result, an absolute. For unless the old action of nature in us be entirely quieted, it is difficult, if not impossible, to found either any true soul status or any divine activity. So remember, the whole goal here is not only for the consciousness to be liberated, but for nature, our body, life energies and mind to also be liberated. In other words, nature will let go of its old habits in which it is embedded in mechanical, ignorant, narrow, petty, reactive consciousness. And as it is liberated, it will awaken into a divine energy, in a free, subconscious energy that will freely flow. If such a radical transition is to be made, then there has to be a passage in between where all the old has to be let gone of. Or if nothing else, if the goal is simply to be in a state of liberation, then we would want also those old tendencies to be quieted and to have subsided. So that the true soul status can begin to glow out. Our nature acts on a basis of confusion and restless compulsion to action. The divine acts freely out of a fathomless calm. So there are 2 opposite poles. Below is the habit of confusion and restless compulsion. Now, if you observe these 2 terms, they capture the core of the problem. On the one hand, we do not see correctly, we do not know correctly. We are always playing through as if mirrors or layers which cover, deceive, hide, distort. And so we are confused about who we are to begin with, and as a result confused about all that we do, how to do it, what to do, and so on. In the midst of this confusion is the second, a restless compulsion. Something pushes, nudges, urges, pulls, drives, we do not know from where. Because it emerges within us, we take it that it's our choice. There are many interesting experiments one can do in what is called covert hypnosis is the term used, where somebody in a casual conversation throws certain suggestions, and at the end of a few minutes, you end up wanting to do something, or you end up speaking certain things which the person has been subtly implanting within you as suggestions. That you chose it, it was your choice, you made a decision, and this is in free will. And all the time, the person is in full control of your expression. You're totally unaware that the impulse rising within you was originating outside. But that's because we do not know where these impulses come from to begin with. Mostly, they are a bunch of restless activity of nature, compulsion, which push. So suddenly, I get a restless compulsion, I need to eat. And the compulsion says, I'm craving something sweet. My mind captures that and declares it as, I choose to eat something sweet. You walk into a large buffet, 30 items or 30 items. You probably can't eat all of them. If you took a little bit of each, you would still not be able to enjoy any one completely. You obviously have to narrow down. What do you pick? And observe in such situations how you choose. Or somebody says, think of a number between 1 and 10, freely. Observe how your mind works. It leaps to something. But who leaped? Not you. You kind of turned in, became quiet, and something popped up from somewhere going to one number. If you wait long enough, another thing pops up and goes to another number, and another thing goes to another number. Out of these, you may veer to one or another. Notice how that happens also. One of them is familiar to you, feels more comfortable, has some deep association of which you're not fully conscious. You tend to veer towards it. And at that moment, perhaps the idea comes, oh, but I have to choose freely, and this number is what I would have chosen because I like it. Therefore, I deliberately choose the other. I've gone through many layers of a kind of a decision making, but at each step, the thing is popping up from somewhere. And a skilled person can play with that, throw suggestions, and evoke a number from you. This restlessness prevents us even from sitting quietly. You sit quietly to do nothing, the mind moves. If your body is not sufficiently trained, after a while, your legs start moving mechanically, and you're not even conscious. If nothing else, some muscle is tensing and releasing. And it is amazing when you watch how people normally are, unable, victims of their own restlessness. So our nature acts on a basis of confusion and restless compulsion to action. All of our life is built on this. On the other side, the divine acts freely out of a fathomless calm. A calm, not superficial, but which goes all the way fathomless. You cannot fathom its depth. Goes all the way to a depth which is so profound, so immense, as to be completely in silence of self. And out of that, freely, something flows out and moves to action or expresses itself. And the two are opposite of each other. Into that abyss of tranquility, we must plunge and become that. if we are to annul the hold of this lower nature upon the soul. The hold is a strong grip. Even when it has been loosened and the threads have been frayed, there is still the old habit or a covert influence of the nature. If you want to be completely free of that grip of the lower nature, then into that abyss of tranquility we must plunge and become that. So there are 2 degrees of it. There's a plunging, and then after you have plunged, you can come out of it and you could come back to what you were. Or you plunge in and you become that, so that even when you emerge from its depths, you still are that. That's when it has been established and it rules rather than the restlessness and confusion of lower nature ruling. So that is the reversal which has to take place in this sense. There are many reversals in the spiritual life. There is the reversal of the awakening of the psychic being, of the interiorization generally, of the deepening of the experience in the self, or even an experience of transcendence. All of these involve a complete recasting of all our relationships with the world. And so here, the founding in the fathomless calm, becoming that, is what completes the freedom from the lower nature's restlessness. Therefore, the universal jiva first ascends into the silence. Therefore, the universalized jiva first ascends into the silence. It becomes vast, tranquil, actionless. So this is first requirement. After that, we have a choice. What action takes place, whether of body and these organs, or any working whatever, the jiva sees but does not take part in, authorize, or in any way associate itself with it. So this station has to be firmly established. Things may still continue, but you are no more associated with, authorizing, or taking part. Now the 3 words he has used are all important and they represent degrees. He goes in this sequence first. The jiva sees but does not take part in. What does it mean to take part in? So let's say I woke up from sleep. I have a craving for food. And I look at feel my tongue. I feel the need for something salty. It's craving. At that point, who is craving? I can say, well, it's not me. It's the body. It's its habit. And I'm going to teach my body, look, this is not the right time to eat. I can ignore it. But more often than not, I feel this craving and I identify with it. I need. And the more I identify, the more the craving grows. I need. I get restless unless I put something in my mouth. This has degrees. Instead of a full identification, I may observe the craving and I say, all right, perhaps it's good for my body. And so I'm accepting this craving which has risen up and I give it what it needs. There's a 3rd degree where you stand back. This is not me, this is not my body, old habit. But something identifies with interest. Oh, that's what it feels like. That's an interesting feeling. There can be degrees of taking part, but here nothing takes part in it. 2nd degree is, beyond this now, 2 more levels. 2nd level is nothing authorizes. When it's time to eat, something inside the consciousness accepts that yes, hunger is now necessary or acceptable. You will find when you are deeply involved in work, so deeply that you forget yourself in something very interesting, sometimes an hour or 2 can pass You have not felt hungry, although your lunchtime has passed by more than an hour or two. Someone says, oh, it's time for lunch. Oh, is it? And then when you turn your attention to it, suddenly the stomach starts growling and all the responses begin. Often, when you're not as deeply engrossed, you may not be aware that it's time, but something inside, some subliminal layers has accepted and says, okay, it's time for the hunger. Something has to sanction before nature's habit is allowed the kicking in. When there's a complete refusal or non-acceptance of that sanction, what happens to nature? It is as if you were fully involved, engrossed in work and forgot the hunger. All the activities of nature in this way lose their support. At best, there are subliminal layers which have their own old habitual tendency, but they do not have anything from your active consciousness or in any way associate itself with. There is a complete separation from all the nature's habits and tendencies. Who am I then? I'm not the body, I'm not the life energy, I'm not the mind, I'm none of these things. I am this pure silence. Plunge into and become that fathomless calm. There is action, but no personal actor, no bondage, no responsibility. So at that point, you being free, the rest of your nature may still continue. Action may continue. So in this case, the body is hungry, the mind sanctions, and all that stuff is happening, but I am not in the sanctioning. I am eating, I'm going through my daily routine. Where am I? I'm in this immense silence. And I can turn my attention and watch this life, this thing happening, the body doing. It's meeting people, the mind is saying hi, hello, smiling to everybody. But I am in this immense silence. There is action, but no personal actor, no bondage, no responsibility. If I turn my mind away, all this would simply fall down, lapse. If I keep the mind turned outwards, but not engaged, it's going on mechanically. So there's an extreme of this separation. At that point, there's nothing which is personal. Things are happening, but they are not personal. One can even see your personal life moving mechanically as you would see somebody else's personal life moving mechanically, especially from a distance. It's a very interesting experience we've all had at some time or other. You climb at the top of a building or top of a hill and you look down at the city below. You see these little matchboxes of cars or buses moving. Little creatures like ants, human beings like ants, getting in, getting off, going around, each obsessed with their own worries. And you observe all this somewhat dispassionately, and you say, oh, I am also like that when I'm there. But right now, it's a different feeling. You are as if separate, you're free, you're not in that daily rush, a rat race, as they call it. That gives you a sense of what it's like. But you could at any point go down, engage with, and get sucked into that movement, forgetting that status of watching from above. But as long as you're there, your own body and mind could continue like that, but you are not personally involved. If personal action is needed, then the jiva has to keep or recover what has been called the form of the ego, a sort of mental image of an I, that is the knower, devotee, servant, or instrument, but an image only and not a reality. So from this poise, which is so immense and so overwhelming, you can still kind of engage with or put up a front of a focus. There's a conversation happening This personality is speaking, and you are watching impersonally, or you may choose to engage personally, at which point it's as if a part of you authorizes a temporary form or enters into, projects a temporary front, which has the form like the ego, the old memory of it, as if I am separate now here, personally involved. Term here, what has been called the form of the ego, a sort of mental image of an I. But what is the role of that I? What does it feel itself in relation to you or the divine consciousness? He gives you 4 words: knower, devotee, servant, or instrument. And again, there are degrees of involvement in personality all the way through to something which is totally impersonal. The knower is I entering, I know what I want to say. I know that there is this immense peace, this awareness, this state of freedom. I know. The second is devotee, where it is not I know, but there is a peace of the divine. There is only from me this gratitude or this self-giving of myself as a child to its mother, as a devotee to the divine. But I am devotee. A third degree further frees even from this sense, servant. It is almost as if this is my role, I have no choice, I have not even the sense of being a devotee, which is a special place. I do what I'm asked to do. I have no personal interest in it. When a servant sweeps the floor, he's not sweeping his own floor, he is sweeping someone else's floor. When you're doing your work, when you're living the life, you are doing someone else's work, the divine's work, not yours. You may take interest in serving better, but it's not for yourself. It's always for the divine. And if tomorrow the work is taken away from you and given to someone else, well, it's his choice, it's his work. It was mine to begin with. It doesn't bother me. And a fourth degree where all of these personal elements completely fade out. There is only the sense of being an instrument. The flute, when you play on it, does nothing. The player blows, the wind moves, the player pushes the stops, the music comes out. What is the flute doing? Nothing at all. And this is the nature of the instrument. The hammer hits the nail. What is the hammer doing? Nothing. It's the person holding the hammer who moves it. So one feels oneself only an instrument. I'm actually doing nothing. I'm only used as a point of support by something else. It could use this support, it could use that support. I do actually nothing. The flute remains exactly what it was when it's used or when it's discarded. So there are 4 degrees of the sense of the form of the ego, a sort of mental image of an I. That is the knower, devotee, servant, or instrument. But an image only, and not a reality. This is something which is difficult to relate to in life. The closest experience we have normally is when you're in the midst, let's say, you're in the midst of a very important telephone conversation. All your attention is now engaged in this discussion. Totally no awareness of what's happening around you. And at that time, the doorbell rings, and perhaps the postman brings a letter. You're required to sign. and you cannot break the conversation on the phone. At that point, you will find as if a part of your mind turns, takes the pen, signs, puts the letter away, but you are still fully engaged here. And afterwards, if you turn and ask, did I sign? What did I do? You even don't have a memory clearly because you were not engaged in it fully. You get a sense of that. I still engaged with the postman. I still did that work. I was not in it. It was almost mechanically done. So there are a few experiences in life like this where as if a part of us momentarily turns. To the other person, you went through all the expression required. And so it was there. But if they're sensitive and they look deeply, they will feel you are not there. If the person is sensitive and inwardly more awake, they will look at you and say, you seem to be far away somewhere. What's happened? Now, it could be because of worry, or it could be because of a state of liberation. I'm reminded of two incidents. There are many others, but these two particularly come to mind right now. One was with somebody in a different city. He's somebody who had some experiences of partial awakening or some awakening of light or consciousness. And he had declared himself now enlightened. So I've mentioned his example before. I had asked him then, do you know the difference between enlightenment and self-realization? And he didn't know. So we had a different conversation there. But this was a different occasion. We were having lunch in the middle of the city. And I was looking at him and I was feeling something very familiar, deeply nourishing as a vibration. And I looked at him and there was a sense as if he's not here, a sense of something wide and free. And I'd never felt it with him before. And then I asked him, I feel you are in a different state. What is it? And he said, for the last few weeks, I think it was 4 weeks. He said, for the last few weeks or 4 weeks, I have been trying to live in the way the universe would be observing it. You see, the idea is very interesting. And it's a very useful exercise to even enter this kind of an experience. My life from inside my head, from inside my personal interests all the time, I'm identified with me. But if I look at myself and my activities from that vastness of the universe, what would the universe look like when it looks at my life and looks through this personality and this activity? It's a bit like being at the top of the mountain and looking down at the city. So part of you tends to identify with that freer, vaster consciousness. And it was very beautiful to be with him because of that state he was in. Later, perhaps a year or two later, when I met him again, it had gone. It needs to be worked upon to establish. But for that duration, at least, it was something which was there, impersonal, vast, behind. Another example which is of somebody who was a practitioner in a non-Islamic Sufi lineage. And she was in her teacher's house after the group meditation. She had the role of washing the teacups. People had drunk tea, left their vessels, and there were 2 people working there washing the vessels. And I came out from the hall and I was walking by. I turned and it hit me. Of the 2, one was more normal, but this one person, and I tried to figure out what is it, something very unusual. And I sensed she was completely empty. There was no person. It was as if there was nobody there. There was just this body doing its thing, washing the vessels. And I said, wow, this is an achievement. But it's normal when one first has it, to be able to do it when you're concentrated. She was in a state of concentration while she was very conscious, washing the vessels. Normally, when the person engages with somebody else, immediately the personality returns in the personal contact by habit. I watched her, and as I watched, she turned around, looked towards me, and smiled and made contact as she would in a personal level, and she remained completely empty throughout. I said, wow, this is an achievement. To be in activity, to engage on a personal level and still maintain not one ripple of agitation, of personal influence coming in. She was like that. And it hit me. It really hit me. And for several days, that thing remained. I think it was 3 months later she passed away. She had an illness, apparently, and it came suddenly and all that. But spiritually, she had prepared herself, or the soul had prepared itself, or had asserted itself. I don't know what it was. But obviously, it was the result of a conscious effort. She was in a sadhana, very intense. And it was one of those very moving experiences, although briefly had. It's possible to be like this in the midst of life, in the midst of the most extreme circumstances. Now, this is not our highest goal. It is an intermediate experience. From this, something further will happen, which he will be describing later, where from this poise, from this state of liberation, the divine consciousness will now fill this empty vessel. Fill and then flood out through it. And at that point, you will sense perhaps the immensity of the silence behind, but then also the immensity of a flood of ocean that will pour out through it. From that poise of stillness and peace, an ocean will flow out. That is when we say a divine being, a divine personality. It was the nature of the experience people had when they met Sri Aurobindo and the mother. With Sri Aurobindo, I remember Panditji's elder sister, when she was describing, there were several experiences, but one of them, Panditji in particular, he said, when he saw Sri Aurobindo, it was this immensity of a solid peace. And he said he felt the only thing which would compare with this was the Himalayas. Imagine you're in front of these massive mountains, not just one mountain, but a range of mountains extending far beyond the horizon, and all of them in this majestic height of peace. Snow white, perfectly still, pure, bare, massive on that scale. In one of Kalidas's plays, there is a verse where he extols the Himalayas, and he declares them as the measuring rod of the earth. They're so large and so permanent that they measure out the earth, literally. That kind of massiveness in an individual body form of the human normal size. And so what are you meeting? You are not meeting this body form, you are meeting that. And yet through this, the whole ocean is there, the whole universe is there in this wandering drop of the form. How is that even possible? We cannot visualize, but we can feel the impact of it. We can feel the immensity of it. You can be overwhelmed by it, but you cannot understand. You cannot reduce it to any kind of term of your normal experience. That is the goal towards which we have to move, of which this poise of silence and emptiness is a foundation. So I took these examples to show what it's like when we speak of instrument. The person is The form is there doing its thing. Who is doing? There's no person. It is being done. That's all. But an image only and not a reality. If even that is not there, still action can continue by the mere continued force of Prakriti without any personal actor, without indeed there being any sense of an actor at all. For the self into which the jiva has cast its being is the actionless, the fathomless, still. So the self is supporting, nature mechanically is going on. And you can have a condition where even that is not there. There is only this behind. Nothing involved. Action continues by the force of Prakriti without any personal actor. This is that complete emptiness. What you do with it afterwards, you can stop there and say, this is it. I'm liberated and that's all I seek. Or we can say, this is the first foundation now on which a greater truth can be established. Sri Aurobindo takes this description further, but before we enter that, we will find it useful to read from some of his sonnets which describe this or allied experiences. There is one sonnet in particular which is called The Dual Being. It describes this double status of consciousness. The dual being. There are two beings in my single self. A Godhead watches nature from behind, at play in front with a brilliant surface elf. A time-born creature with a human mind. Tranquil and boundless like a sea or sky, the Godhead knows himself eternity's sun. Radiant his mind and vast, his heart as free. His will is a scepter of dominion. The smaller self by nature's passions driven, thoughtful and erring, learns his human task. All must be known and to that greatness given. Mind and life, the mirror and the mask. As with the figure of a symbol dance, the screened omniscient plays at ignorance. So this little creature in front, time-born, with a human mind, brilliant surface elf, little thing full of activity, but is a mirror and a mask for the omniscient, who's behind, in front is this play of the ignorance. So this is the dual being. There's another. So this is a poise where abandoned this attention to the surface being, liberation. I have thrown from me the whirling dance of mind and stand now in the spirit's silence free. Timeless and deathless, beyond creature kind, the center of my own eternity. I have escaped and the small self is dead. I am immortal, alone, ineffable. I have gone out from the universe I made and have grown nameless and immeasurable. My mind is hushed in wide and endless light. my heart a solitude of delight and peace, my sense unsnared by touch and sound and sight, my body a point in white infinities. I am the one being's sole immobile bliss. No one I am, I who am all that is. So there are a few like this which describe other further experiences also. So from this you can see how we are drifting gradually towards a poise where one could even let go from the world, withdraw completely, or even discard the world as irrelevant or even illusory. But he's taking us deeper in this direction because these are not only experiences one must have, but they have great utility in the poise of liberation from the lower nature's tendencies. When that is established firmly, then we can turn around and change things and master them truly. So, the path of works, now he joins the three works, knowledge, and devotion at this point. The path of works leads to the realization of the Lord. But here, even the Lord is not known. There is only the silent self and Prakriti doing her works. Even as it seems at first, not with truly living entities, but with names and forms existing in the self, but which the self does not admit as real. So in the works, we reached a point where we had a relationship with the Lord. You realized that there is the divine. Here, where is the divinity? There is only this blank, there is only this silence. Silent self, and in front, this play of Prakriti, capital P, that is nature, immense, mechanical. Doing her works. Even, as it seems at first, not with truly living entities, but with names and forms existing in the self. So this is the poise when you watch, and everything is happening, people are going around, things are being done. They're not people, they're like puppets moving around. This is not real, it's like a stage set. But it's moving, as it seems at first. Nothing living, just names and forms, which the self does not admit as real. There is only the immensity of the self, and these names and forms moving around doing their thing. The soul may go even beyond this realization. Now we are going step by step, deeper and deeper. It may either rise to the Brahman on the other side of all idea of self, as a void of everything that is here, a void of unnameable peace and extinction of all, even the Sat, even of that existent which is the impersonal basis of individual or universal personality. Or else, it may unite with it as an ineffable that, of which nothing can be said. For the universe and all that is does not even exist in that, but appears to the mind as a dream, more unsubstantial than any dream ever seen or imagined. So that even the word dream seems too positive a thing to express its entire unreality. These experiences are the foundation of that lofty illusionism, which takes such firm hold of the human mind in its highest overleapings of itself. And the three sentences which we have quickly read because we want to get the full picture. Two great possibilities further. Getting beyond the sense of self. In the sense of self, at least there is some foundation, something is. There's an existence which is silence, peace, immense, infinite, one. But you could go beyond that to something which is even beyond it. At that point, everything begins to fade out. Even the dream is too much real. And these experiences are the foundation of that lofty illusionism. And you will see in the last 2000 years, this illusionism was established on earth, generally everywhere, as the dominant experience in every civilization. There were the ascetics, those who retired into the forest, for whom the world was a domain either of suffering or of illusion from which to withdraw. And in India in particular, Adi Shankaracharya was the great founder of this whole school. And his experience is in this direction. Massive, overwhelming experience, the full scope of which we will reread to appreciate. But it is so overwhelming that at that point, it takes a firm hold of the human mind in its highest overleapings of itself. When the mind goes completely beyond its limitations, this is what happens. But what is the nature of this illusionism? He will describe in the next paragraph. And then we will understand what it is that we must do from this poise. But why the illusion is so compelling and what is the truth behind it that he has described in these two experiences. So the soul may go even beyond this realization. That is the realization of the self and the Prakriti playing out in front. You're still in the world, so to say. The world is going on, you are not in it. You are in the silence of the self, but world goes on mechanically as a surface movement of Prakriti. When you want to go beyond that, it may either rise to the Brahman on the other side of all idea of self, as a void of everything that is here. So what happens here? There is Brahman in its extreme, which is not these, because these can still relate to the domain of forms, to the idea of an immensity, infinity, one. But there is something beyond that, which is not relating to these. If you compare the sense of the absolute with the domain of the relativity, you can never get to a point where you make a transition from the relative to the absolute. If you take as an image a cone, tip of the mountain, the mathematical tip, which is a tiny, tiny, infinitesimally small point. The whole mountain points to this. You rise from anywhere, you are moving only towards this tip. But where is the tip? You can never capture it. It does not belong to the domain of form or of mountain. It is a mathematical abstraction. That is what the absolute is like in relation to the relativities. To get to that means to completely lose all this. So the idea of Brahman, beyond the idea of self, void of everything that is here, a void of unnameable peace and extinction of all. Everything is extinguished, not just the forms, but even the idea of form, not just the things in space, but even the concept of space, not just the infinity, but even the idea of infinity. All, even of the Sat, sheer existent, even of the existent, which is the impersonal basis of individual or universal personality. Where does individual come from? Individual cannot exist unless there is a backdrop which is impersonal. Against that, we say, one individual, another individual. What separates them? The backdrop of the impersonal behind. Similarly, the universe. Where did the universe come into being? Modern science says Big Bang. So you visualize your Big Bang, something bursting out into what? Into a massive emptiness. Something has to be there into which it bursts out, isn't it? So there has to be something underlying, at least as an idea, something existing in which the expression of manifestation can take place. Even that extinction, existent, is extinguished. What is that like? And so, of course, you have no more words, you have no more any description, but it is merging into that kind of thing which is possible for us and would represent the peak. And beyond that, one more step, one more option is to see it not just by negation of all this, but as something which is beyond all description. So the first movement is to negate in order to get to that. But there's the other way, or else it might unite with it as an ineffable that of which nothing can be said. As long as you're speaking of the self, you're speaking of the existence, sheer existent consciousness, you're still speaking of something. There's something that you experience which you can describe. But that of which nothing can be said, well, nothing can be said. But you can enter it. You can let go of all this and break out into that. That of which nothing can be said. For the universe and all that is does not even exist in that. In that, it appears to the mind as a dream more unsubstantial than any dream ever seen or imagined. So that even the word dream seems too positive a thing to express its entire unreality. Everything becomes unreal, not even a dream, but an illusion, literally. There's a form in which the transition takes place. There are many ways it can take place, but there's one form. As you're, so to say, drifting out, letting the whole universe fade away from you, as it fades out, and you turn towards that, there comes a kind of a breaking out, so to say. You're still in a sense of space or time, but formless space, formless time, infinite, eternal, simply is. And then as you lean deeper and deeper into that, there comes a sudden transition where suddenly the whole universe as if shakes and as if breaks up. The analogy would be when you're watching television or a movie broadcast, you're immersed, it's real for you, you are in it and it's real. Suddenly, the broadcast breaks. The CD has a scratch. The picture rips apart momentarily. And at that moment, you're as if shocked into wakefulness. Oh, this is just a dream. This is just a film. This is just a drama. Something breaks this and throws you out of it. Something like that happens. Momentarily, one is thrown out and the whole universe as if shakes, as if an unreal drama, a television screen on which the signal has broken, it's gone. And you can neither speak of time and neither speak of space, neither speak of existence, nothing. And that is itself like a shock of awakening. And there's no other way to describe it except as a kind of, you woke up from this. Against that poise, even the experience of the self is not relevant. So, Even the word dream seems too positive a thing to express its entire unreality. Nothing is real anymore left. These experiences are the foundation of that lofty illusionism which takes such firm hold of the human mind in its highest overleapings of itself. At this point, one can be in an immersion in something undescribable, since it is beyond space and time and form or even existence or Satchidananda. How long one stays is irrelevant. The consciousness enters, is lost, returns, and at that point, what can you say? You have nothing to describe from it. If at all, in the transition, because you still had a vocabulary there, you could say you woke up into that, but you cannot even call it real or unreal. And so there is no word to describe it. Ineffable. There's no way to formulate, no way to express, no way to describe. And in the highest living traditions, both in the Vedantic, in the Advaitic, and the Buddhist tradition, it is this which they consider as the highest liberation. But now when you look back at all the stages Sri Aurobindo has described before this, each of them is a liberation. Each of them is a kind of an awakening, a freedom of consciousness. One point from which you can say freedom from a practical ego, another point from which we say utter freedom from ego. After that, again, there are experiences, many. At any of these, you could have stopped and said, now that the ego is gone, this is it. There's nothing more left. And this is the reason why you will find in various traditions different descriptions of the goal, also different conclusions for our relationship with life. Each of these would give you a different perspective towards the world and towards life. And after this, while there is not a higher realization than this, because this is that indescribable, inexpressible, but there is a greater completion of the realization. This represents an extreme. Remember, the goal Sri Aurobindo set to reach the highest, but also the widest. So you could have a narrow tip breaking out into the highest, but the widest would include its wideness, including the manifestation. And so now there has to be something more, which is not higher, but wider and therefore more complete. A more complete realization is necessary, which is what Sri Aurobindo will now take us to as the goal of the integral yoga. And how we come to that is the main focus from here. But first we have to understand what this represents. These ideas of dream and illusion are simply results in our still existent mentality of the new poise of the jiva and its denial of the claim made upon it by its old mental associations and view of life and existence. Now, there's a very important statement, not immediately obvious for what he's saying. The idea that this was dream, the world was dream or illusion, is the result of our still existent mentality of the new poise of the jiva. The jiva has entered this poise. You, the person ascending, has reached this poise, but there's still a remaining mentality consciousness that denies the claim of the old mental associations and view of life and existence. All that is not it. But the part which remains of the mentality is in this mode of denial, which experiences the illusoriness or dreamlike experience. In other words, the implication is this: if you could know by a different consciousness, not of the mind, you might not see it as dream or illusion. He doesn't elaborate that here. He explains that in the Life Divine. If you saw the same experience, see that in any experience, you have to ask, which is the consciousness experiencing or registering the experience. Remember, here in the whole effort, it was the mind's awareness going beyond itself. And so whatever remains, the fine thread of the mind's consciousness, that is still the substance through which one experiences or registers the experience. That denies all that mind knew, all that mind saw before, and all that mind can know. And so in the process, it denies itself and appears therefore as a dream or an illusion. But if there was a consciousness above mind, greater than mind, the consciousness of that itself in the way it knows itself, perhaps it would see it differently. Sri Aurobindo explains how the approach to the absolute can take place on any level of consciousness. You can even enter it from the physical consciousness or the vital consciousness or the various gradations of mind. When the intellectual mind thus breaks out to the absolute, the intellectual mind knows things only by comparison, by differentiation, by dividing, by joining pieces. And so when intellectual mind approaches the self and the absolute, how does it meet it? There's nothing to compare. There is nothing which you can associate. You cannot divide, you cannot join, you cannot build it by anything. Therefore, it is blank, empty. So entering through the intellectual mind as you approach the absolute, you see it as a huge void against which everything falls away. And this is the approach of the experience established by the Buddha. And therefore the formulation of the Buddhist teaching is built on the training of the mind and the mind's mastery and eventually its liberation into this. But since the entry was through the mind, you look upon this as the void. Adi Shankaracharya entered the same experience through the intuitivized mind, through an intuitivized consciousness, therefore still mind but an intuitivized mind, and the intuition knows things not by analysis and synthesis but by identification. So as he approached this, he experienced the delight, ananda, the pure consciousness, the sheer existence, and he declared that as the fullness out of which all this is born. One approach calls it emptiness, another calls it fullness. The difference is only of the way you were reaching out with your instruments. Just to take an analogy, if we had to measure the density of air with your hands, everything you try to grasp with your fingers, you cannot catch the air. And so you say the air is non-existent. But if you had to measure it by blowing, your breath hits the resistance of the air around it, experiences contact, and therefore you'll say, there is something here, very fine. The instrument you have used changes the perception. The limitation of the instrument is now imposed on that which you're trying to know. And so in the discussion in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo says, you can rise still above even the intuitive consciousness, because the intuitional consciousness also knows only a piece. It is a finite consciousness. And so Shankaracharya saw this as the fullness, Sat, Chit, Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. But because it could know only a piece, it knew that as real, and against it the universe as unreal. So the Buddhist approach sees the world as a domain which is real enough, but a domain of suffering from which you withdraw into the absolute, which is an emptiness, dissolution. The Shankarite experience, as it enters this fullness that is the origin, the self, the absolute, it turns and sees the world as illusory against this fullness, because it is an intuitive consciousness. But there is a still higher level of consciousness, further many levels, including what Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental, but finally the supramental consciousness, which knows infinity and unity. And when that consciousness looks at this absolute, it sees it coterminous with the world. The world is an extension of itself, is a power of itself in manifestation. There is neither illusion nor real suffering. There is only the oneness manifesting. And so from the supramental consciousness, all these experiences can be seen as specialized experiences, facets of a limited perception. But in the supramental consciousness, all these can be had simultaneously, but a more complete knowledge is now existent. And Sri Aurobindo is taking us to that view. And in that experience, the world is real as that from which it emerges. And it is still essentially the oneness of the divine in manifestation. So here the key was these ideas of dream and illusion are simply results in our still existent mentality of the jiva, the result of the new poise and the still existent mentality. And its denial of the claim made upon it by its old mental associations and view of life and existence. In reality, the Prakriti does not act for itself or by its own motion, but with the self as Lord. For out of that silence wells all this action. That apparent void loses out as if into movement all these infinite riches of experience. They all come out from that so-called void, which seemed as the void. To this realization, the sadhaka of the integral yoga must arrive by the process that we shall hereafter describe. So that process will be the theme for the next chapter. The immediate question is, what then, when he so resumes his hold upon the universe and views no longer himself in the world, but the cosmos in himself, will be the position of the jiva? Or what will fill in his new consciousness, the part of the ego sense? So this is the question now before us. When you are no more in the world, but the world is in you, what is your poise as jiva? Or what is it that fills the role of the ego? And that we will take up next time. It's the next half of the paragraph. But both this and that need a little more elaboration. And so we will keep it for next Friday. At this point, we just review all the stages, levels through which the release from the ego takes place into its highest extreme, as practiced in the path of knowledge, and in particular the path of integral knowledge, which includes all the other paths in its scope, but goes beyond them. The practical approach we have taken, that is the form of the practice, and then the degrees of this liberation, and all variations of experiences and degrees within each of those have been mapped out. And you will see, for each one of us, one or more of these may happen. We may not always seek to realize each of these variations, but you will inevitably pass through one or more of them, because the nature of the path, because it takes up all the parts of our being, and each of these variations aligns with a different part of our being. Inevitably we touch them briefly, at least. When he describes, for example, the poise of the mental image of the I, the form of the ego which we may temporarily take up, the knower, devotee, servant or instrument, you'll see they resonate with different parts of our being. When the mind consciousness is more involved and the focus is more through the form of ego through the mind, I am the knower. When it is form of ego through the heart, I am the devotee. When it is form of ego, through the will and action, I am the servant. Or if it is through the more essential form of ego, not tied to the three layers, but that essential ego core, more detached, more abstract, then it is simply instrument. Because the nature of the path is integral, and each of these instruments has to be purified, inevitably we will experience at one time or other each of these. But according to our temperament, more of one experience, less of another. Sri Aurobindo in himself traces out each of these fully. That was part of the mission, part of the work for which he came, to forge a new path, which can hold the fullness of the human type, human nature. And so each of these variations he had to deal with and work upon in himself, fully develop in himself, and unite in the larger movement of the integral yoga. Therefore, he can describe each of them in minute detail, but also each of them in its fullness as an overall approach or path. And since in his own consciousness he united them and joined them in the one framework, the single practice of the integral yoga, it is possible now. The path itself has been as if formed in him and through him, imprinted in the human consciousness. And so anybody taking up the approach of the integral yoga, all of these facets and fine distinctions are as if held in the overall path, in the consciousness in which we flow. And so we touch, we experience, even if we don't actively choose to dwell upon these variations. So as a path, it is very rich. And when we look back at the earlier portion of the fluctuations, when there is a lack of sufficient purity, there's a fluctuation of the experience and then the screening and the experience and the screening, you will notice through the fluctuations it will touch different parts of our nature. And so all these variations get touched and briefly are experienced at least. So this is the release from the ego, and we can briefly take up any questions or any comments. Next week. Yes. So the process itself for that will be in the next chapter. But what he will discuss in the next paragraph will be where is the place for the jiva, the person consciousness, and what takes the place of the ego. Because there is still need for focal point through which one acts. Where is that focal point?
Problem is the individuation.
Yes.
A little bit more.
Yes. So you see already, first level of individuation is possible in what he has earlier described as a sort of mental image of an I, but an image and not a reality. So one projects, one picks up even the ego sense, plays with it as a vehicle through which to act, but knowing full well it's a pretense. Like an actor on stage who behaves as if he's angry, but knows that he's playing a part. One takes on the ego form. That is a thing one can do when one is in that state of no person, no bondage, no responsibility. But from this, when we complete the process of the highest liberation and then regain our hold on the universe, at that point the I does not need to enter into a fake ego form. The I is embracing the universe, and there is an I still, and you can act from there. It's a very different experience to act from there than to take up a temporary ego front. You may still do that because you're free to do it. But you can act now from a center, which is no more ego, which is totally free. So we'll continue this next Friday. Om.